we get into today's topic, I want to give you a little secret to reading and understanding history. It can make all the difference in the world. Often historians and those of us who read history, we tend to approach it by reading history backwards. For example, we're looking at the events prior to the Civil War, and as we look at all of those events as we did so Monday, we know that the Civil War was going to take place. So we tend to read into those events that perspective. And you can't help doing that. Historians have to do that. We all have to do that. So we all are going to read history backwards, but it is especially helpful to also read history forwards, which means to put yourself in the perspective of the people who were living the history, to put ourselves in the shoes of our pioneers, in the shoes of antebellum Americans. They had no idea from their perspective, looking forward, that a great cataclysmic war was coming and would devastate the nation. They had no idea. Even our pioneers who knew something big was going to happen, they believed it was the second coming of Jesus, they had no idea that the Civil War would play out as it did until Ellen White's Parkville Vision in Parkville, Michigan. So as we go through the material this morning, we'll again look at history in relationship to this vision. I want to go back to primary sources, and that's the key to reading history forward. You go back to primary sources and try to think what they were thinking and look forward. They could not see the future. So that is very helpful, I have found, in studying history. The snow, Michigan snow, clung to the leaves. The winter chill enveloped the small community of Parkville, Michigan. The Sabbatarian Adventists were meeting there for a revival series. James White, on January 12, had just finished speaking. And J.N. Loughborough, who would become the church's historian, later would record this experience and write it in his book about the early history of Seventh-day Adventists. So we'll pick up the story, how he describes it. In Rise and Progress of Seventh-day Adventists, after James White had finished, Loughborough picks up the story there. At the close of the discourse by Elder White, Mrs. White gave a stirring exhortation, after which she took her seat in a chair. In this position, she was taken off in vision. The house was crowded with people, and it was indeed a solemn place. After coming out of the vision, she arose and looking about the house said, "There is not a person in this house who has ever dreamed of the trouble that is coming upon this land." Now keep in mind, looking at history forward, they had no idea that within 3 months the Civil War would begin. They only knew of one major event that had transpired. Keep that in mind now. People are making sport of the secession ordinance of South Carolina, but I have just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state. There will be a most terrible war. In this vision, I have seen large armies of both sides gathered on the field of battle. I heard the booming of the cannon and saw the dead and dying on every hand. And I'll get to this later on this morning, but Loughborough said, or he recalled, that as he sat up front, as she shared these things, several men in the audience shook their heads in disbelief. Then I saw them rushing up, engaged in hand-to-hand combat, and looking back on it, this is Loughborough reading history backwards. He put in parentheses, bayoneting one another, because by the time he wrote this immediately in his diary, but when he put it in the book years later, the Civil War was finished, and so he read this back into it. And so he added, bayoneting one another. Then I saw the field after battle, all covered with the dead and dying. Then I was carried to prisons and saw the sufferings of those in want, who were wasting away. Then I was taken to the homes of those who had lost husbands, sons, or brothers in the war. I saw their distress and anguish. Then, looking slowly around the house, she said, "There are those in this house who will lose sons in that war. Now, this filled many in that room with disbelief. They, along with other Americans, could not comprehend the thought of a war of this magnitude. It was simply out of the question and not in their thoughts. While the 1850s had been a decade of many significant things that divided the North and the South, the idea of them coming to battle one another was still not really in everyone's heads. Now, I should add, in all honesty, to everything that people were saying, there were a few others who were predicting war. But the way in which Ellen White predicted it here and recorded it in writing later is unique. And there's so much that she said, we can only get to the heart of it. But I want to look at some of the key elements of this vision. First of all, the verity of the vision. This vision was not ever written out as it was given here, at least in this form. She would record it later in a different way, but the details that are given here in this particular church in Parkville on January 12, 1861 were unique. Loughborough states in the preface of his book that he depended upon his daily diary to authenticate White's description in the Parkville vision, and we can be thankful that he kept a good diary that helped him write a very helpful history book in the 1890s. A non-Adventist, Martha Ensign, present at the service, corroborated Loughborough's narrative. He puts this in the book, and early Adventists, our pioneers, did that a lot. They put down or recorded eyewitness testimonies of things that took place to corroborate it. Early in the war, Ellen White put this vision in written form in February 1862. So the essence of this vision is recorded later, and I will describe it as she wrote it in 1862 on Thursday when we look at specific battles and the outcome of these battles and the loss of life and so forth. So we do have a written version of this vision, but that would be sometime later. But we're looking at the vision as she gave it 3 months prior to the booming of the cannons on Fort Sumter. So let's look at it section by section. People are making sport of the succession ordinance of South Carolina, she said, but I have just been shown that a large number of states are going to join that state. Let's look at the historical background of succession. It really began with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the most fateful presidential election in United States history, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, we discussed a number of events, especially on Sunday. We looked back over 40 years of antebellum America. Those early events that I described, such as the Compromise of 1820, we could call those long-term events that would lead to the Civil War. And then as the decades progressed, you get into the 1850s, then you have short-term events, such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act I spoke a lot about on Sunday. And then the most significant event of all, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in the fall of 1859. That was more an immediate event that led to the Civil War. As I mentioned, then many historians believe that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, because of its impact in both the North and the South, was the spark that led to the Civil War. It's more accurate to put it that John Brown's raid and the aftermath of it really laid the groundwork for the highly charged and controversial election of Abraham Lincoln. Because by the time of the election, the emotions were still really at a high fever from Brown's raid. As I shared with you, the North praised his act, and the South saw him as the devil incarnate, and the South became more defensive and closed themselves up and felt that they were all alone, and the North was out to get them, so they were in a defensive posture. In fact, perception played a major role in the Civil War. So the election of Lincoln was most fateful. we could really describe the election of Lincoln as a trigger event. You had the long-term and short-term events, but Lincoln's election was a major trigger to the Civil War, and that in turn triggered secession, which is the immediate cause of the Civil War, the succession of the states, which this vision is about. Let's analyze just for a moment the election, the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party, you remember I talked about the emergence of the Republican Party, a reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. It emerged, and the Southerners hated the Republican Party. The Republican Party represented the worst fears of the South, and Lincoln embodied its principles. In the November vote, Lincoln did not receive a single vote in the 10 slaveholding states. That's why this was so fateful. It was a total sectional vote. The North voted for Lincoln and the South for their candidate. Not a single vote in the slaveholding states for Lincoln. Perception was the key. The South perceived that the Northern Republicans were out to get them and destroy their way of life. In fact, that really wasn't so. For the South, their perceptions, that is, Lincoln's election meant they no longer controlled the presidency as they had for years, and that's a part of the controversy. A number of the presidents prior to that had been from the South, all the way back to Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and they were able to control the presidency to a great degree and get things their way. That's, or I should say, the compromises I discussed are a result of that. And even President Buchanan, who was of the North, they called these Northern leaders in the government dough-faces, that they were leaders in the North, but they supported the South. And they called them dough-faces. So you had a number of dough-face leaders and presidents. So they lost control of the presidency. They were not happy with that because the Republicans were Northern and totally disconnected from the South. Lincoln, they said Lincoln supported John Brown's raid, and that surely is against us. In fact, they were wrong on this matter. The Republican platform that Lincoln ran his campaign on categorically rejected John Brown's raid. I should say they categorically condemned it as wrong. But the Southerners thought he supported John Brown's move to insurrection of the slaves. Republicans, they thought, would not only keep slavery out of the territories. Remember the Western territories, the North wanted to make them free, and the South wanted to make them slave territories. So the Republicans, they believed, would not only keep slavery out of the territories, they would at some point down the line strike at slavery where it already existed, and that was in the South. But in fact, Lincoln made it a special point to communicate to the South that while he was adamantly against spreading slavery in the Western territories, he would not touch slavery in the South. He would leave it alone as president. He promised that in his campaign, but the South was in such a defensive posture, they didn't hear that, or at least they heard it and didn't believe he meant it. They thought Lincoln was against them. So you see again, the emotions are intense and something big is going to come out of this. That was the feeling of everyone. And again, the South believed that blacks would become equal citizens, which meant the Southern white race would be reduced to their level. This was a major fear of the South. In fact, that last point was a major factor in leading to secession. I'm going to share with you a bit of evidence on that fact here down the road in a moment when we look more at the succession and the reasons for succession, the cause of succession. This is important to understanding the backdrop of this vision of Ellen White and her other statements about the Civil War. Very important. So as you can see here, the South misunderstood, misperceived what the Republicans, what Lincoln really wanted to do. In fact, some have said that the Civil War really didn't need to have been fought. It was all a matter of misunderstandings, misperceptions, And really, it was. But if the Civil War had not taken place, slavery would have been around a lot longer in the United States. God knew what needed to be done. God was at work even in the misperceptions, in the emotional intensity of the South, I believe. So, the beginning of succession. Everyone knew that the month following the election would be crucial in terms of the South's reaction to Lincoln's election. I mean, they knew, okay, they are not going to be happy with Lincoln. And indeed, it was. Those months were crucial. It began with South Carolina, the most extreme of the southern states. And if you read Antebellum America, South Carolina had a history. They had threatened succession repeatedly over the years, and now, finally, they had done it. It was on December 20, 1860, that South Carolina, by a unanimous vote, 169-0, to succeed. And it was a great day for them. They were full of joy. You read the record, and right when the decision was made, people were lined up in the streets waiting for the decision, and they made it. And they say men took their hats off and threw them into the air. Women waved their handkerchiefs. People shouted and sang. Fireworks went off. Church bells rang. There was a great celebration all day long. South Carolina was now free. And they made the point that the United States Union is now dissolved. And they were proud of that. And I think of that celebration on the screen, by the way, as a picture on your left of the succession. It's the document of their succession. And then you have the Charleston Extra. Union dissolved. I think of the exuberance and the excitement they felt that day. And again, this is looking back. I'm looking backward now. From their perspective, they were going to be free and do what they want now. But looking back on it, looking backwards, I know what they were in store for. I know that the Civil War would take place. And I also know that during the war, South Carolina received a beating, repeated assaults. It was one of the states devastated as a result of the Civil War. And so there's a sadness as I read and hear their shouts of joy over succession. They had no idea what was coming upon them. And now, let me tell you, the states that followed South Carolina that I'm about to discuss, they did not do this for war. While they were in a defensive posture, anticipating the possibility of an invasion from the north, they didn't want war, and they didn't succeed to start a war. It was for their state's rights. But their rights were to keep their way of life, which was based on the institution of slavery. Some took South Carolina's succession seriously. In fact, one South Carolinian said, "This means we will never have peace again." But others made sport of it, interestingly. In the vision, Ellen White said, "Some are making sport of this." Loughborough recorded this for us. He said, "The people in the North little thought of a war growing out of that." In the New York Tribune of that week, Horace Greeley, the editor, said, "A few old women with broomsticks could go down there and beat out the rebellion there is in South Carolina." And speaking of it the week before, he said, "If someone with the firmness of Andrew Jackson would go down there and say, 'South Carolina, where are you going?' they would reply, 'Back into the Union again, sir.'" That's making sport of succession. They had heard South Carolina for so long threaten succession. When it finally did happen, it was like, "Oh, it's not going to last. They'll come back into the Union." That was the sentiment of many. Not everyone, but a number felt that way. And that is what was in the news as Ellen White shared this vision with the Parkville Church. Within weeks of Carolina's secession, 6 other lower states left the Union. Remember, she said, other states will follow this state. Mississippi succeeded on January 9. This is now in 1861. Florida, January 10. Alabama, January 11. And then January 12 is when Ellen White had her vision. She mentions only South Carolina. Evidently, the news had not reached them yet about these other 3 states that had succeeded. And to think about it today, you flip on your computer and the news flashes. We get instant news today. But back then, news didn't travel that fast at all. It took sometimes days to get the news of an event. So evidently, they were not aware of these other states by January 12 that had succeeded. Again, part of the North's reaction to South Carolina's secession. Here is one of the satires in the newspapers. There are lots of cartoons and pictures about these types of things in the newspapers of the day. And this is after South Carolina had succeeded, and this was published sometime in January, and those other states, Alabama, Mississippi, they're making fun. You see, I can't use my laser here to point at the screen, but you can see at the head, the man riding the hog, that's South Carolina. The idea was that South Carolina is leading the way in succession. They're going to go whole hog over the cliff. So in other words, succession was going nowhere. It was going to disaster, but they're still poking fun at it. And the other states are following. The other animals following them behind. You've got Georgia running down the hill. But she said a large number of other states to follow after the vision of January 12. By then you've had 4 states that have succeeded. Georgia succeeded on January 19. Louisiana, January 26. Texas, February 1. Interesting story behind Texas succession. And not all of these states were unanimous. Alabama and Texas had a little bit of disagreement within them about succession. You had different levels of successionists. You had the fire eaters, which were the ones who just wanted succession no matter what. And then you had moderates and conservatives and so forth. We won't get into all of those details. Then after the bombing of Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteer troops, you had the upper states succeed. Now these early states that succeeded were the Deep South. But the upper states succeeded after that. Virginia, April 17. Arkansas, May 6. North Carolina, May 20. Tennessee, my own state now, June 6. So just as she had said, there'll be a large number of states follow. And something happened that they didn't expect. Those early states that had succeeded came together into a convention in Montgomery, Alabama, on February 4 through March 11. And during that series of meetings, that convention, they created the Confederate Constitution and launched the Confederate nation. And the North had not expected this. Lincoln, you can imagine how Lincoln felt about this. Not very happy. There's a picture of the Confederate Constitution. As they worked on their Constitution, they worked a lot quicker than the founders of the United States Constitution because the Confederates had a blueprint. They had a model to go by. And as you read how they put their Confederate Constitution together, you get the sense that they had the U.S. Constitution in one hand and the blank page in the other, and they copied much of the U.S. Constitution into their Confederate Constitution. If you read the two, they're very similar. But there were some marked differences. A major difference in the Confederate Constitution was this. They explicitly guaranteed slavery in the states. Now, America was birthed as a slave-holding country, but the Constitution, the Declaration of Freedom for All Men, used euphemisms. It really didn't explicitly talk about slavery, and it could be interpreted different ways. The South interpreted it one way, the North interpreted it another. But they were explicit in the Confederate Constitution. They guaranteed slavery in the states. So right there in this primary document, we have slavery as the heart of the Confederacy. And there were a few other changes, but much of it was similar to the U.S. Constitution. They were accused by the North of starting a new revolution, but they insisted they were not engaged in a revolution. But in many ways they were. After they finished the Constitution, ratified it, voted on it, passed it, there was excitement in Montgomery. Again, there were cheers and celebrations and fireworks and so forth. Again, they had no idea what they were in store for, but they felt like it was a new revolution. They were free from the bondage of the North, so to speak. Now they could maintain their own way of life with no pressure from the North. Their object was to preserve their system of labor and social order. A system of labor and social order based on black slavery. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the president of the Confederacy on February 18, 1861. Here's a picture in Montgomery of that inauguration. Later they would move the Confederate capital to Virginia, to Richmond, Virginia. But it began in Montgomery, Alabama, my home state. I was born and raised in Alabama. I'm an Alabama boy, a redneck, Alabama redneck. Not all Alabamians are rednecks, but I grew up as one. One of the most debated issues relating to the American Civil War is its cause. The cause of secession. After the war, Confederates argued that slavery was not the cause. They said that it was states' rights. They were declaring their independence. There were territorial issues and economic differences and constitutional arguments and historic political abuses from the North. They were declaring their independence. Today, this is a debate among historians, and you've got traditionalists, you've got revisionists, you've got fundamentalists. I will deal with all of this in my book that'll hopefully be out in about a year on this subject. I'm going to have an appendix that'll deal with the cause of the war, and I'll deal with all the arguments and have all the documentation. The endnotes to that appendix will be long because there's a lot of material about this. But I, myself, as I've already alluded several times, I go along with the major historians of the Civil War that see slavery at the heart of it. But there are revisionists, there are different views, and the neo-Confederates, if you will, the lost cause idea, and a number in that tradition argue that slavery was not at the heart of it. Even some of the leaders of the Confederacy would argue later. But what that is doing is looking backward in history and not forward. What I want to do the next few moments, I want to look at a statement Ellen White made about this matter, and then I want to look forward. I want to go back into the minds of the secessionists, into the minds of the new Confederate government. What were they saying about the reasons why they formed their government, why they succeeded from the United States and became the Confederacy? This is very important because Ellen White makes this interesting statement. Not just giving you raw history here. There's a point, and it all has to do with the profound insights of the gift of prophecy. This is from Testimonies, Volume 1, page 253. This is jumping ahead now. This was written and published in February of 1862. But she's reflecting back on the period we're discussing now of succession. Listen to this profound insight. The North did not understand the bitter, dreadful hatred of the South toward them, and were unprepared for their deep-laid plots. Now, what I just covered earlier was quick, but it was a lengthy, detailed process of planning and plotting. The North had boasted of their strength and ridiculed the idea of the South leaving the Union. They considered it like the threats of a willful, stubborn child and thought that the South would soon come back to their senses and, becoming sick of leaving the Union, would with humble apologies return to their allegiance. And I just touched on some of the evidence. In my book, I'll have an abundance of documentation regarding this statement. The facts are so clear. They viewed the South as a stubborn child who whined when it did not get its way. That's how the North viewed it. But they had no idea of how resolute the South was on this matter. And they discovered soon after the establishment of the Confederacy. The North have had no just idea of the strength of the accursed system of slavery. And this last sentence is significant. I'm bolding it. It is this, speaking of slavery, it is this and this alone which lies at the foundation of the war. Now you see why I'm laboring on this point and giving you all this historical background? That's quite a significant statement. There are many today who would attempt to refute that statement. But the way it's worded is so carefully and insightful. Because as I alluded to earlier, we don't want to be oversimplistic and say that the North was in a crusade against slavery. There were other elements involved. But at the foundation of it all was slavery. That is such a spot-on statement. When you read the history, when you read it forward, go back into their shoes and look what they were thinking and what they were saying. So, let's read history forward now. Each Southern State Convention document lists slavery as a major issue in succeeding. You can read them online. The state's reasons for succession. Most of them specifically list slavery. Mississippi was very specific and represented how the other states felt. Let's look at Mississippi's declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the succession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union. They tell us explicitly why they succeeded from the United States. Here's some excerpts from their document. In the momentous step which our state has taken of dissolving its connection with the government of which we so long formed a part, it is but just that we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That's how strong they felt. A blow at slavery is a blow at civilization. And they felt the North was attempting to blow away slavery. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. And of course, they chose succession. Slavery was their main reason for succession, as it was the other states. We're looking at history forward now. Significant state by Confederate leaders, Jefferson Davis and his Vice President Alexander Stephens. Years later, they both would write lengthy documents arguing that slavery was not the cause of the war. But it was probably not a bad idea politically to do that, because after the war and slavery ended, it wasn't a good idea to continue to argue slavery. And so they put a spin on it. But if we go back and listen to what these two leaders said at the time of succession and establishing the Confederacy, we get quite a different perspective. What were they saying at that time? Jefferson Davis said to his new Confederate Congress in April of 1861. Listen to what he said. The labor of African slaves was and is indispensable to the South's economic development. Now listen to this next sentence. With interest of such overwhelming magnitude imperiled, the people of the Southern states were driven by the conduct of the North to the adoption of some course of action. What was that? Succession and creating the Confederate government. Some course of action to avert the danger with which they were openly menaced. So he is very clear. Slavery, our way of life. In fact, he's really saying, in other words, we're protecting our social system based on slavery. Alexander Stephens is often quoted in his famous cornerstone speech. On March 21, 1861, Confederate States Vice President Alexander H. Stephens gave what is now called the Cornerstone Speech, which, among other things, talked about the reasons for secession. At the heart of it, he said, and you can read these entire speeches online, by the way, if you Google them. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests. He's speaking of the Confederacy, new Confederate government. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And that was their thinking, that the white race is the superior race. This, our new government, the Confederacy, that is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. I don't know that it could be put any stronger and more straightforward than that. Slavery was at the heart of secession and the forming of the new Confederate government. Slavery was their way of life. Charles B. Dew is a historian of the Civil War. And in this excellent book, Apostles of Disunion, he engages with primary sources and documents how there were commissioners going through the South spreading the news that the North wanted to take away slavery and make the black man equal to the whites. And this would bring down the superior white race to their low level. And that was spread throughout the states, and he documents how that was a key factor in succession. He shows you throughout the book. They were afraid that not only their way of life would be taken away, but their identity as the superior race would be taken from them, and blacks would become their equal. And that was more than they could tolerate. And they succeeded because of that. And he documents it in that book. And he concludes the book by saying that slavery and race was at the heart of secession and the Civil War. So there are plenty of historians that are engaging with the original primary sources and finding this evidence. So Ellen White's statement, slavery, this and only this, is at the foundation of the war, was so on target to that day. Now let's go back to the timing of the vision. January 12th, when it was given. Was there a threat of war at that time? I want to give you some documented evidence that most people in the North and in the South had no intention of war. Even after the secession and the establishment of the Confederate government, the Confederates really did not intend to launch an open war on the North. And the North didn't really want that. There may have been a few fire eaters in the South and a few in the North, but overall that was not the feeling. In the North, the President Buchanan, shortly before Lincoln, President-elect, took over, argued, and I'm not going to cite him, I'm going to cite others. He argued that succession, people are overreacting to succession. There's going to be no war. And the Secretary of State-elect, William Seward, argued the same thing in a speech. In the South, interestingly, Thomas R.R. Cobb said the most universal belief here, that was at Montgomery, is that the capital of the Confederacy, as I said before, is that we shall not have war. So the North and the South were not anticipating war even after the string of states succeeding. Abraham Lincoln 2 days before his inauguration, he said, "I have felt all the while justified in concluding that the crisis, the panic," and there was a crisis and a panic about it, "the anxiety of the country at this time is artificial." Even Lincoln was not anticipating war. And I have all of Lincoln's, the multi-volume edition of his speeches at home, and you go through those, and several years later, he acknowledged, at that time, we didn't believe that war would happen. But it did indeed. Alexander Stephens told a Savannah, Georgia audience on March 21, quote, that their revolution, the Confederacy revolution, had thus far been accomplished without shedding a drop of blood, that the fear of deadly collision with the Union they had renounced was nearly dispelled. Because people naturally thought, oh, this could create war. But then they said, no, not really. According to Civil War historian Shelby Foote, a congressman from Alabama said there would be no war and offered to wipe up all the blood that would be shed with a pocket handkerchief. And Foote, in his witty way, said, I've always said someone could get a PhD by calculating how many pocket handkerchiefs it would take to wipe up all the blood that was shed. It would be a lot of handkerchiefs. Senator James Chestnut of South Carolina offered to drink all the blood shed as a consequence of secession. It even became, again, that's rhetoric, see. They're using rhetoric to say war is not going to happen. And it even became a common saying in the South during the secession winter that a lady's thimble will hold all the blood that will be shed. They had no idea what was coming as we look backward in history, knowing that a horrible war was coming. And I'm going to tell you something later this week, particularly on Thursday. And this will be all in relationship to what Ellen White said about the war. But to give documentation and evidence of what she said about the war, I am going to share eyewitness testimonies of soldiers in the battle and the aftermaths of the battlefield, what they saw on the battlefield. And it will be graphic. So I warn you, if you come on Thursday, you might want to bring an earplug if you have a squeamish stomach. But I feel that needs to be told to really understand the significance of her statements about the death in the Civil War and the suffering in the war. So now let's take a quick look at the 12 weeks following the January 12 vision. You had the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on March 4. You had the Confederate Constitution established by March 11. Then you had the beginning of the war, the official beginning of the war, April 12, 13, the bombing of Fort Sumter. No life was lost, but this officially began the war. There's a very interesting story behind how this all took place and Lincoln's maneuvering. Lincoln was a new president with no military background, but he learned quickly and became the greatest president in the history of America, greatest war president. But his maneuverings behind that scene to get the blame off the states or off the U.S. for starting the war is simply brilliant. But you have the bombing of Fort Sumter. The war officially begins. On April 15, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. Here's a picture of original paper. With that, on the left side, I'm pointing my laser at my laptop. That doesn't help you very much. On the left side, you see the call for 75,000 volunteers. It was only for enlistment for 3 months. And then, as a result of Lincoln's call for these volunteers, the upper states succeeded. The deeper south are the blue states you see on the screen. And then in the middle, the gray state, the red, of course, is the north, and the green ones are the border states that were in between. But the gray states, those are the upper states that succeeded after Lincoln's the bombing of Sumter and the call for 75,000 volunteers. So by early summer, before the Battle of Manassas, which I will talk about tomorrow morning, there's no terrible war yet. In her vision on January 12, she said, there will be a most terrible war. Large armies on both sides gathered on the field of battle. I heard the booming of the cannon, and I saw the dead and dying on every hand. That had not happened yet. So, where's the truth of the vision? War had started, but here was the feeling of everybody about the war. The North expected a short war. The New York Times had already dogmatized after Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. Whatever war there is may easily be made a war at sea, a war of blockades, a war having for its sole object the protection of American property and preservation of American commerce. And that type of war, of course, would not involve large armies clashing on the battlefield. On May 4, Harper's Weekly editorially concluded that if Abraham Lincoln is equal to the position he fills, this war will be over by January 1862. Again, a short war. And as I get into tomorrow's subject, Manassas, they all came to that battle thinking it would be over quickly. And that would end the rebellion. Lincoln himself must have had the same hope even as late as July 4 when he wrote to Congress, "It is now recommended that you give legal means for making this contest a short and decisive one." Here is another satire printed in the papers. It's an anti-Confederate, printed in the North, satire. And you'll notice at the bottom left corner, "Secession exploded." You have Winfield Scott, who's laying there on the American flag, the greatest American hero who fought in the War of 1812 and really designed the strategy for the North in battling the Confederacy. And you have the cannon going off and exploding, and you have South Carolina in there. The demons of secession. Again, they're making sport of it. And the idea is that one massive explosion, one quick battle, and the war will be over. That was the feeling, see, and it was printed in the papers like this. Jan Loughborough helps us out with so many details. He correctly pointed out that after the bombing of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers on April 15, and they were for a short term of only 3 months. So even that call expected a short war. 75,000, that should do it. At this time, the American military only had about 15,000 or so troops. So he called for 75,000 to squelch the rebellion, to get it over with concisely. Loughborough recalls this incident. He was watching soldiers responding to this call as they were leaving Battle Creek, Michigan. "I saw at this time," Loughborough penned, "one company of soldiers starting out at Battle Creek. A jolly company there were too. They were too. As full of glee and hilarity as though going to a picnic. And as the train pulled out from the station with waving hats and handkerchiefs, they shouted, 'Goodbye, boys. We'll be back in 6 weeks.'" And then Loughborough remarks, "Poor fellows," looking back on history, "many of them never returned." Here is a picture, a popular picture of Confederate troops before the war. Some say this was before the secession, and others say that it was right when they were getting ready for battle. But either way, you notice the looks of excitement on their faces. They're kind of proud and they're exhilarated. See one with his knife doing this way. They're ready for battle. And by the way, Confederates, the South, even today, the South, when it comes to defending your country, Southerners are often the first to volunteer. That spirit is still there. And that's how they felt down in the Confederacy then. They were defending their territory, and these boys, they were ready to defend their own country. Well, many of these men did go off to war in this picture. In fact, all of them did, and most of them didn't come back. Most of them lost their lives. Others were maimed. Even the soldiers expected a short war. It was only one small group who knew without question, because of their faith in the prophetic gift, that a major civil war was about to take place. And that was a small community of Sabbatarian Adventists who heard Ellen White share her vision on January 12, 1861. L.E. Usey aptly assessed the situation in his excellent work on Ellen White in the Civil War. It was a master thesis for Andrews University written in 1965. He summed it up this way, and I draw a lot from his material, and I will be using his material in my book as well, but building on it also. "It is evident, therefore, that Ellen White's apprehensions on January 12 at Parkville of an impending major war was in sharp contrast with the lethargy which prevailed in the northern states for months. That there would be 4 years of blood-packed warfare, thousands of casualties, numerous fresh cemeteries, public and private debts as common as rainwater, and endless personal tragedies for both Northerners and Southerners was frankly beyond the ken of most Americans. They understood little of the nature of 19th century fighting. that would soon take place, having had little acquaintance with it other than Indian skirmishes and the Mexican War dress rehearsal. James McPherson, the major American Civil War historian, has written several definitive books about the Civil War. He said this: the Civil War was the most dramatic, violent, and fateful experience in American history. And I keep in mind Ellen White's original statement, a terrible war. At least 620,000 soldiers, and since he wrote this, the estimate has risen higher. At least 620,000, 100,000 soldiers lost their lives in that war, 2% of the population at the time. If 2% of the American people were to be killed in a war fought in the early 21st century, the number of American war dead would be 5.5 million. So think about that proportionally. Note this, and this is all factual. More Americans were killed or died in this war than all of the other wars combined that the United States has fought. A most terrible war is coming. The number of casualties in one day at the Battle of Antietam, and I'll talk about the details of Antietam on Thursday, was nearly 4 times the number of American casualties on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Twice as many people were killed and mortally wounded than were killed by the terrorist attacks on the United States on 9/11, 2001. And we will talk about what it was like in this battle and the aftermath of those battles later on. After Loughborough experienced and recorded this initial vision by Ellen White, a year later, he came back to that same Parkville church and was giving a seminar on spiritual gifts in the church, and he reminded them of this vision a year earlier. And he shares his experience. This is in his book, Miracles of My Life. And he writes, and the first part of this, he's reflecting back on when he was sitting up front, watching the audience as Ellen White shared her vision about the war on January 12, 1861. This is a year later. He writes, near the stand sat Judge Osborne, whose wife was a Sabbath keeper. This is as he's listening to Ellen White originally share the vision. By his side sat Mr. Shellhouse, owner of a large woolen factory, both leading men in the Republican Party. When Mrs. White told what was coming, they looked at me and shook their heads. 1 year from that time when I spoke in the same church, these two men sat together again. My subject was spiritual gifts. An illustration of the gift was as manifested by Sister White. I referred to the vision of January 12, 1861. This time, these men did not shake their heads, but instead, their faces were in their handkerchiefs, and they were sobbing bitter tears. Alas, one had lost his only son in the war. The other had lost a son on the battlefield, and another son was in a southern prison. The elder of the Parkville church later told me that he knew of 6 or 7 others there who had lost sons in the war. So again, that is Loughborough's testimony. And I think it can be corroborated with other evidence. So as I wrap this up this morning, I've gone till about 12:15, 12:20 the last couple of days. I'm going to give you a break. I'm going to be done here in about 5 minutes. Get you out not too soon after noon. Is that better? The significance of the vision. What is its relevance for you and I today? What is its relevance for us as a people, as Seventh-day Adventists? God gave Ellen White this vision 3 months before the war began. Why? I think of Amos 3:7. For the Lord does nothing without revealing His secret to His servants, the prophets. And of course, the context of that passage refers to the biblical prophets. But I think its application can certainly apply to those who had the prophetic gift, the spiritual gift of prophecy after the closing of the scriptural canon. The Lord reveals things to His prophets. Why was this warning of the coming war given to this small group of Adventist believers? Now think about this with me for a moment. Ellen White was a prophet to the Adventist people, a small group, very small group, not to the nation. I mean, what she had to say would have been extremely relevant and interesting to a larger population. They probably would have ridiculed it, but her other insights into the war would have helped if they had known them and believed them. But she was not a prophet to the nation. She never was, never will be. Her prophetic ministry was limited to a specific small group. She was a prophet to the Sabbatarian Adventist, later the Seventh-day Adventist. Why was this vision given to this small group? What difference did it make, that knowledge? Well, again, like reading history forward, they didn't know. Before this vision, they had no idea. They knew that things were intense in the political world, and the division was deep between the North and the South, but they really had no idea that a cataclysmic war was coming until this vision. And because they had seen the veracity of Ellen White's prophetic gift already, they believed this. Let's analyze this situation for a moment. Who was present at this meeting in Parkville? Prior to this meeting, about a week or so, James White published a notice in the Review and Herald inviting people to come to Parkville, Michigan. Listen, we wish to say through the Review that the brethren and sisters at Parkville, Michigan request a conference at their place commencing on January 11. Remember, the vision was given on January 12. Commencing on January 11 at 6 p.m., we invite brethren J.N. Loughborough, J.H. Wagner, James White, John Byington, and as many more as can come to labor with us. Those individuals were the key leaders of this Sabbatarian group that would eventually become Seventh-day Adventist. They were the leaders of the church. But the invitation extended further. And we would extend a cordial invitation to all of like precious faith to attend this conference. That's basically, in a nutshell, the believers. All the believers in the Sabbatarian message, in the unique doctrinal package that would become the pillars of Seventh-day Adventism. Again, they didn't become Seventh-day Adventists until 1863, in the middle of the war. They were Sabbatarian Adventists at this point. So all the leadership of the church were there. Key leaders of the developing Adventist church were present. The Civil War would impact every American and cause hardship, even in the North, including the pioneers of Seventh-day Adventism. They were growing a church, and they needed to know what was ahead in order to brace themselves and to work for the war. Because American soil, that was the environment in which Adventism grew. And insight onto what was coming helped them prepare, helped them brace for it. God was watching out for His people. This vision was not for the nation, it was for the Adventist people, this insight that a war was coming. God was showing His mercy. God was working with His people. God was preparing His remnant people for something terrible that was about to happen and would last for 4 long years. A terrible war. God had His people in mind during America's greatest crisis. And He protected them. Does He not have His people in mind today? Does He care about the remnant today? Does He care about your life and my life? Yes, He does. I think a great personal lesson from this vision is that God is thinking about His people. And while we may not get fresh visions today, we have, first of all, Scripture. And if we read it aright, we can understand the signs of the times. And then after that, We have the spirit of prophecy. These writings that give us profound insight into our world today, that articulate for us the Adventist worldview, the great controversy. And this, by the way, was given, this vision, at a time when she was thinking about her great controversy. She had already written out the initial version of the great controversy. God is in control. God has His people in mind. And with all of this insight He's given us, He's thinking about you, about your life, about your future. He knows your future. He knows my future. He can see the end from the beginning, and He is concerned about us. And whatever is going to happen in this nation, in this world, and we're sure not out of the hot water yet. There are some things that are going to be coming in the future. We don't know what, with this nation, with the world, but God is in control. And He will carry His church through, and He will carry you through it as you and I look to Him. Isn't that good news? All that we get from a vision to a small group of people on a Michigan winter day, January 12, 1861. God is good and merciful. Amen? Heavenly Father, we want to thank You for Your deep love for us as a people, for us as individuals. We're grateful for the insights from the gift of prophecy and how they synchronize with what was happening during that time. We want this information, Lord, this understanding of history to increase our appreciation of the prophetic gift and enhance our faith. That's what we want. And we also want that assurance that You care about us as individuals, that You know our future, and You're planning for our future. So we surrender to You just now. In Jesus' name, amen.